The dust never settles in South Texas. It rises with the dawn, swirls through the afternoon heat, and clings to everything it touches. In the summer of 1943, it settled on the barbed wire fences of Crystal City internment camp, coating the metal in a fine layer of American soil. Behind those fences, 14-year-old Emiko Sato pressed her face against the mesh, watching the world beyond her prison. The morning roll call had ended. The guards had counted their human inventory and retreated to the shade of their watchtowers. In the silence that followed, she could hear something else, the rhythmic tapping of a boot against wood. 50 yards away, leaning against a fence post, a young guard in a wide-brimmed hat moved his foot to some internal melody. His name was Private Joe Kincaid, though Emiko didn't know that yet. She only knew the sound, steady, hypnotic, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The other children had gone inside to escape the heat. The adults sat in their barracks, writing letters to relatives they might never see again. But Emiko remained at the fence, her dark eyes fixed on the cowboy who danced alone in the Texas dust. She had been dancing once, before the war. In the backyard of their home in Los Angeles, her grandmother had taught her the careful steps of traditional Japanese dance, each movement deliberate, each gesture carrying centuries of meaning. That was before the soldiers came to their door, before the hastily packed suitcases and the train ride to nowhere. Now, in this place where cultures collided and hope withered like desert flowers, the only rhythm she knew was the sound of boots on hardpan earth. The guard finished his silent dance and walked away, leaving only dust devils in his wake. But something had awakened in the girl behind the fence. Something that would prove stronger than barbed wire, deeper than fear, and more enduring than the war that had brought them to this forgotten corner of Texas. What the American public didn't see couldn't hurt them. That was the logic behind places like Crystal City, camps built in remote corners of the country, far from newspaper cameras and curious eyes. By 1943, more than 30,000 people of Japanese, German, and Italian descent had vanished into America's shadow geography. The maps told the story in red dots scattered across the western states. Manzanar in California's desert, Heart Mountain in Wyoming's wilderness, Crystal City in the endless expanse of South Texas. Each dot represented thousands of lives interrupted, families scattered, dreams deferred in the name of national security. Texas had become the epicenter of this invisible war. Its vast emptiness made it perfect for hiding America's unwanted populations. German submarine crews captured off the Atlantic coast found themselves sharing mess halls with Japanese farmers from California's Central Valley. Italian immigrants who had lived in America for decades suddenly became enemies of the state. The bureaucracy that created these camps operated with clinical efficiency. Forms were filed, trains were scheduled, and human beings were reduced to numbers on manifest sheets. The Department of Justice called it alien enemy control. The families inside called it something else entirely. Crystal City sprawled across 290 acres of scrubland, surrounded by 10-foot fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter like mechanical vultures, their searchlights sweeping the compound each night. Inside, hastily constructed barracks housed entire families in single rooms, privacy sacrificed to the demands of mass confinement. The irony was not lost on those who understood history. America, fighting a war for freedom across 2 oceans, had created its own archipelago of camps on home soil. Liberty was defended through imprisonment, democracy preserved through detention. But within these contradictions, life found a way to persist. Children played between the barracks. Adults organized schools and grew gardens. And sometimes, when the desert wind carried music across the fence, a 14-year-old girl would remember what it felt like to dance. Dawn arrived at Crystal City with with the harsh clang of a metal bell. 6 o'clock sharp every morning, without exception. Emiko would wake on her narrow cot, surrounded by the sleeping forms of her family, her parents, her younger brother, all crowded into a space barely large enough for privacy. The morning routine never varied. Dress quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. Line up outside the barracks for roll call. Stand at attention while guards with clipboards counted heads like livestock. Recite the Pledge of Allegiance to a flag that had abandoned them. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, a cavernous building where conversations echoed off. Corrugated metal walls, watery oatmeal, weak coffee, and the persistent taste of dust that seemed to season everything in this place. The Japanese families sat together, speaking in hushed tones, while the German and Italian internees claimed their own corners of the room. After breakfast came school, if it could be called that. The classroom was another converted barracks where children of enemy aliens learned American history from textbooks that made no mention of camps like Crystal City. They sang patriotic songs in the morning and studied their parents' homelands in the afternoon. Caught between two nations that had no use for them, Emiko excelled at drawing. When words failed her, and they often did in this place where English and Japanese mixed like oil and water, she sketched flowers on scraps of paper. Cherry blossoms from memory, desert wildflowers from life, and sometimes the silhouettes of cowboys dancing in the distance. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Adults played cards or tended small gardens behind the barracks. Children invented games with stones and string. The older boys talked of joining the army when they turned 18, proving their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their families. But on weekends, something different happened. The local guards would gather near the camp's western fence for informal rodeos, roping cattle that wandered too close, showing off their horsemanship for each other. The sound would drift across the compound. Laughter, guitar music, and the rhythmic drumming of boots on earth. That's when Emiko would find her place at the fence. Fingers wrapped around the wire mesh, watching a world she could not touch. The cowboys would drink beer and tell stories, their voices mixing with the desert wind. And sometimes, just sometimes, one of them would glance her way and tip his hat, before looking away again. The fence was supposed to keep her in. But increasingly, it felt like the only thing keeping the outside world at bay. Private Joe Kincaid had never wanted to be a prison guard. At 22, he was the son of a West Texas rancher, more comfortable with cattle than people, more at home on horseback than behind a desk. The war had changed everything. His older brother had shipped out to the Pacific. His younger brother was somewhere in Italy. Joe drew the short straw and ended up guarding civilians in the middle of nowhere. The work didn't sit right with him. These weren't soldiers or spies. They were families. Kids who played with toy soldiers. Mothers who hung laundry on makeshift clotheslines. Fathers who stared at the horizon with the same empty expression Joe had. Seen on cattle during drought years, he carried his guitar everywhere. A battered acoustic his grandfather had given him before the old man died. Music was his escape, his way of drowning out the uncomfortable questions that gnawed at him during the long, hot shifts. When the other guards gathered for poker or drinking, Joe would find a quiet spot near the fence and play. That's how it started. A girl, maybe 14, watching him from behind the wire. At first, he pretended not to notice. Fraternization with prisoners was forbidden, and Joe needed this job. His family's ranch was struggling, and his army pay helped keep food on the table back home. But she kept coming back. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky red and the temperature finally dropped below unbearable, she would appear at the fence, never speaking, never demanding attention, just watching with dark eyes that seemed older than her years. Joe began to play for her without admitting it to himself. soft country ballads that his mother had hummed while cooking, Western swing numbers he'd learned from radio broadcasts. Sometimes traditional cowboy songs that spoke of wide open spaces and freedom that stretched beyond the horizon. The girl would sway slightly to the music, her movement so subtle that only someone watching carefully would notice. Joe found himself watching carefully one evening as he finished a particularly melancholy tune about a cowboy who couldn't find his way home. She pressed closer to the fence. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Joe realized she was humming along, had memorized the melody from nights of listening. He looked around. The other guards were busy with their evening card game. The watchtowers were focused outward, scanning for threats that never materialized. In this moment, separated by 10 feet and a mesh of wire, a cowboy and his enemy shared something that had nothing to do with war. Joe began to play again. This time something slow and simple, a waltz his grandmother had danced to at church socials before the world went mad. The girl's eyes widened with recognition. Music, it seemed, was a language that needed no translation. The lessons began without words. Joe would position himself near the fence at sunset, guitar in hand, and play simple 3/4 time. Emiko would appear on the other side, her bare feet already moving to rhythms that seemed to live in her bones. First came the basic steps, Joe demonstrating on his side of the wire while Emiko mirrored his movements on hers. Right foot forward, left foot together, step to the side. The waltz was forgiving, patient, perfect for teaching across the divide of mesh and metal. The other prisoners paid little attention at first. Music was common in the camp. Someone was always humming, singing, or playing a makeshift instrument. But as the evening lessons continued, a few began to notice. An elderly German man would pause in his evening walk to watch. A group of Italian women would glance over from their knitting circle, their faces softening at the sight of a child finding joy in such a place. Joe taught her more than steps. With subtle gestures and patient repetition, he showed her how to hold her frame, how to follow a lead she couldn't touch, how to make the earth beneath her feet feel like a ballroom floor. Emiko was a quick learner, her movements becoming more confident with each passing evening. The fence became their dance floor, 5 feet wide on each side, separated by wire that might as well have been ocean. But in those moments, when the music played and their feet moved in harmony, the barrier seemed to dissolve. Two young people, thrown together by circumstance and kept apart by policy, found a way to touch without touching. The other guards eventually noticed, of course. Sergeant Murphy, Joe's immediate superior, mentioned it during a briefing. "Kincaid, you're spending an awful lot of time near the fence line." "Just doing my job, Sergeant. Maintaining visual contact with the prisoners. Make sure that's all you're maintaining." But Joe couldn't stop. The evening dance had become the highlight of his day, the 1 hour when his duty felt like something other than a betrayal of his own values. And Emiko, he had learned her name by overhearing other children call to her, seemed to bloom during these sessions, her movements becoming more graceful, more confident, more alive. One evening, as a particularly beautiful sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Joe played a melody he had never shared before, a song his mother had sung to him as a child, about a bird that learned to fly by watching the wind. Emiko closed her eyes and danced, her movements flowing like water, like wind, like all the freedom she had been denied. For a moment, the war ceased to exist. There were no camps, no fences, no enemies. There was only music, movement, and two young souls refusing to let hatred define their world. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a furnace consuming everything in its path. News filtered into Crystal City through official channels and whispered conversations. The firebombing of Tokyo, the island-hopping campaign, the mounting casualties on both sides. Each update made the atmosphere in the camp more tense, more suspicious, more dangerous. The guard rotations changed. Older, harder men replaced some of the younger soldiers. These veterans of other conflicts brought with them a cynicism that poisoned the air. They had seen too much death, lost too many friends, to feel sympathy for enemy aliens and their children. Sergeant Murphy was reassigned to the Pacific Theater. His replacement, Sergeant Davis, was a man whose hatred had been forged in the jungles of Guadalcanal. He viewed the internees not as displaced families, but as potential threats. Each one a possible spy or saboteur waiting for the right moment to strike. Fraternization will not be tolerated, Davis announced during his first briefing. These people are enemies of the United States. Remember that. The evening dances continued, but now they carried risk. Joe had to be more careful, more subtle. He would position himself further from the fence, play quieter, limit their interaction to stolen glances and brief moments when the patrol routes aligned, but surveillance had intensified throughout the camp. Guard towers that had once been manned casually now maintained constant watch. New security protocols required written reports of any unusual prisoner behavior. The net was tightening around every small freedom the internees had managed to preserve. The breaking point came on a warm April evening. Emiko had been at the fence longer than usual, practicing steps to a waltz Joe had taught her the week before. Her movements were becoming more elaborate, more confident, and more visible to anyone watching from the towers. "What the hell is that Jap girl doing?" The voice carried across the compound from Tower 3. "Looks like she's dancing, sir." "Dancing?" "Looks like signaling to me." "Get Davis out here." Within minutes, Sergeant Davis and two other guards were striding across the compound toward Emiko. She saw them coming and froze, her face pale with sudden terror. Joe was too far away to help, too constrained by his uniform to intervene. "You," Davis barked at Emiko. "What are you doing?" "Nothing, sir. Just walking." "Bullshit. You were signaling someone." "Who? That guard over there?" Davis's eyes found Joe across the yard. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Joe saw his own fear reflected in the sergeant's suspicious stare. "Take her to the commander's office," Davis ordered. "And bring Kincaid, too. Time to sort this out." As Emiko was led away between two guards, she looked back once at Joe. Her eyes held no accusation, no blame. Only a quiet sadness that cut him deeper than any anger could have. The dance floor had become a courtroom, and they were both about to face judgment for the crime of finding beauty in an ugly world. Asterisk. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Emiko sat alone in the commander's office, answering the same questions over and over, while officers scrutinized her every word for signs of deception. She denied everything. Denied signaling, denied communication with guards, denied any knowledge of escape plans or sabotage plots. Joe fared no better. His guitar was confiscated, his movements restricted, his evening duties reassigned to other guards. The official reprimand went into his permanent file. Violation of fraternization protocols with enemy alien prisoners. His commanding officer was clear. One more incident would result in court-martial, but the real punishment was the silence that followed. The fence line where they had danced became a no-man's land, patrolled constantly, monitored from multiple towers. Emiko's family was moved to a barracks on the opposite side of the compound. Their brief window of connection had been slammed shut. Then, on August 15th, everything changed. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across America, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Cities erupted in celebration from coast to coast. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. Factories that had churned out instruments of death began planning for peace. But inside Crystal City, victory felt hollow. What was supposed to be liberation became another form of imprisonment. Families faced impossible choices: return to a Japan they no longer knew, or try to rebuild lives in an America that had rejected them. Many had lost everything: homes, businesses, communities, while confined behind wire. The lucky ones had somewhere to go: relatives in unaffected states who could sponsor their release, jobs waiting in cities that had not been swept by the hysteria of wartime fear. But for many, Crystal City had become a limbo between worlds, neither American nor truly Japanese, belonging to neither side of a conflict that had finally ended. Joe was discharged 3 weeks after the surrender. He returned to his family's ranch, but the work felt hollow now. The wide-open spaces that had once felt like freedom now reminded him of barriers, invisible, but no less real than the fences he had helped maintain. Years passed. Joe married a local girl, raised cattle, lived the life expected of a West Texas rancher. But on quiet evenings, when the wind picked up across the plains, he would sometimes hear an echo of music and remember a girl who had learned to dance in the dust behind barbed wire. He never learned what happened to her, never knew if she found her way back to California or forward to Japan or into some new life in between. But sometimes, driving past the empty lot where Crystal City had once stood, he would see grass growing through the foundation stones and wonder if somewhere, in some other place, she was still dancing. 30 years later, in a small elementary school in San Francisco's Japantown, Mrs. Emily Sato stood before a group of third graders preparing for their annual cultural festival. Her hair was gray now, streaked with silver, and her face carried the lines that come from decades of patience and quiet strength. Today, she told the children, "I'm going to teach you a very special dance. It's not quite Japanese, and it's not quite American. It's something in between." The children giggled as she demonstrated the steps, a waltz with subtle modifications, movements that flowed like traditional Japanese dance, but followed the rhythm of American country music. Her feet remembered the pattern perfectly, as if muscle memory had preserved every evening lesson from a lifetime ago. "Where did you learn this, Mrs. Sato?" asked a small boy with curious eyes. Emily paused, looking out the classroom window at the San Francisco skyline. Somewhere in her memory, dust swirled across empty Texas plains, and a young cowboy played guitar while the sun set behind guard towers. "I learned it from a teacher who showed me that music is stronger than walls," she said finally. "That dancing can happen anywhere, even when you think you're trapped." The children practiced the steps, laughing when they stumbled, cheering when they got it right. Emily watched them with a mixture of joy and melancholy, remembering another time when dance had been both rebellion and salvation. After school, she often walked to the small memorial park dedicated to those who had been interned during the war. A bronze plaque listed the camps: Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Crystal City, and all the others. Visitors would read the names and shake their heads at history's capacity for cruelty. But Emily remembered something else. She remembered how humanity had survived even in those places, how music had found ways to cross barriers, how a cowboy and a teenage girl had created something beautiful in the midst of ugliness, something that had lasted longer than the war, longer than the camps, longer than the fear that had built them. The empty plains of South Texas had long since reclaimed the site where Crystal City once stood. The barracks had been torn down, the fences removed, the guard towers demolished. Mesquite trees and prairie grass grew where families had once lived in forced exile. But on certain evenings, when the wind moved just right across the desert, locals swore they could still hear echoes, the faint sound of a guitar playing a waltz and footsteps dancing in the dust. It was probably just imagination, they told themselves. Just the wind making music in the sagebrush. Yet the story persisted. passed down through families and preserved in local folklore. The tale of a Japanese girl and a cowboy guard who had found a way to dance together despite everything designed to keep them apart. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, beauty can take root in the most unlikely places. Asterisk wars end, fences rust, and governments apologize for past mistakes. But the lessons learned in places like Crystal City endure in the hearts of those who choose to remember. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is not violence or protest, but simply refusing to let hatred steal your ability to see beauty in another human being. In the end, it wasn't the barbed wire that defined their story. It was the music that transcended it. A cowboy's guitar and a girl's graceful steps, creating something eternal in a place designed to be forgotten. The dance they shared lasted only months, but the memory of it has lasted lifetimes, proving that some barriers exist only in our minds, and some walls can be overcome with nothing more than rhythm, courage, and the simple human desire to connect. The barbed wire is gone now. The music remains.